away from me! Please, I beg you, don't touch us! Don't hurt her. Take me instead.
In June 1944, a naval engagement unlike any preceding it was unfolding across the expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Yet, the most formidable danger facing the Japanese refugees huddled within the caves of Saipan was not the ballistics of American weaponry. It was unseen. It was crawling. And it was lethal, killing with a speed that outpaced conventional warfare. This is the narrative of how a single instant altered everything. It was a moment that appeared to be a violation but was, in reality, salvation. It was a fleeting encounter between a young woman and a soldier that neither would fully comprehend until many years had elapsed. This is the chronicle of Tomo and Sergeant Edward Mitchell. The island of Saipan had become a living nightmare. The Battle of Saipan had raged for weeks, transfiguring the once beautiful Pacific island into a hellscape defined by violence, desperation, and unspeakable suffering. By June 1944, tens of thousands of Japanese civilians had fled their residences and were concealing themselves in caves scattered throughout the island. They were petrified of what they believed awaited them should they surrender to the American forces. They had been fed horrific tales. They had been warned by their government. They had been told that surrender equated to death, shame, violation, and the total annihilation of everything they held sacred. Consequently, they hid. They huddled together in the obscurity of caves, in cellars, and in underground bunkers hewn into the volcanic rock. Parents clutched their children tightly, whispering reassurances they themselves did not believe. Grandmothers offered prayers to ancestors they hoped possessed the power to protect them. Teenagers clung to one another in the gloom, questioning if they would ever witness sunlight again. Everyone waited. Everyone feared. Everyone listened to the cacophony of bombardment echoing through the stones surrounding them, never knowing if the subsequent explosion would collapse their refuge and bury them alive. For weeks, they endured. They rationed water sourced from underground springs. They ate nothing, or next to nothing. They listened to screams emanating from outside the cave entrances. They heard gunfire. They heard voices shouting in English. They heard the sounds of civilization being pulverized around them. Some did not survive. Some perished from starvation. Some died of dehydration. Some succumbed to their injuries, bleeding out in the darkness, their families helpless to do anything but hold them as they slipped away. Through it all, they clung to their fear of capture, their conviction that American soldiers would inflict unspeakable atrocities upon them. They held on to the belief that it was preferable to die in the darkness than to surrender to the enemy. However, the Japanese were not the only ones observing the refugees. American soldiers, medics, and officers were watching them as well. They watched from the surface, from behind barricades and from medical stations hastily constructed amidst the rubble of what had once been Japanese military installations. Yet, they were not watching out of malice. They were not seeking revenge or retribution. They were watching because something far deadlier than bullets was propagating through the refugee populations. It was something invisible, something that traveled via clothing and skin contact. It was something that killed without discrimination, without mercy, and without regard for age, gender, military status, or innocence. Typhus. The disease was ravaging the island. Military doctors, men such as Dr. Samuel Cohen, had begun to notice a pattern in the casualty reports. The refugee camps were evolving into death zones. People who surrendered were arriving malnourished, injured, traumatized, and infected. Lice were ubiquitous. They infested the clothing, the blankets, the hair, and the skin of everyone who had been hiding in those caves for weeks. With every single louse came the risk of transmission. Typhus was a death sentence in 1944. There were no antibiotics. There was no cure. There was only prevention. And prevention necessitated one thing: delousing. Immediate delousing. Complete delousing. Delousing regardless of whether the refugees understood it or agreed to it. Dr. Samuel Cohen was the senior medical officer assigned to process the refugees arriving on Saipan. He was a man in his 40s, a physician who had spent the last 3 years witnessing humanity at its absolute worst. He had seen gunshot wounds turn gangrenous. He had seen soldiers die from sepsis. He had seen children expire from diseases that, in times of peace, would have been manageable. He had held the hands of men, women, and children as typhus ravaged their bodies, as fevers consumed them, and as their organs shut down one by one. He understood the mathematics of the crisis. It was brutal and unforgiving. For every refugee who was not deloused, 10 more could become infected. For every day the delousing was delayed, the death toll climbed exponentially. The math was brutal, the solution was urgent, and the solution was a new weapon the military had recently acquired and deployed to the Pacific: DDT, dichloro-diphenyl-trichloroethane, a powdered insecticide that had been synthesized just years earlier in Switzerland. Image of chemical structure of DDT. The American military had only recently begun distributing it to frontline units. It was effective beyond anything they had seen previously. It killed lice on contact. It killed fleas. It killed mosquitoes. It was hailed as a miracle cure, a scientific achievement that would save thousands of lives. However, there was a problem, a serious problem. Clothes harbored the insects. Skin harbored them. Hair harbored them. The only method to fully delouse someone was to remove their clothing, spray them from head to toe with the powder, wait for the powder to do its work, and provide them with clean garments. In 1944, on an island still scarred by battle, still echoing with the sounds of recent violence, asking a Japanese woman to remove her clothing in front of an American soldier was asking her to do something that every fiber of her being screamed against. It was asking her to violate her culture, her religion, her sense of modesty, and her survival instincts that had kept her alive through 17 days in a cave. This is where Tomo came in. Tomo was 23 years old. She had been born on Saipan. Her family had lived on the island for generations. They owned a small textile business near the harbor. Her father had died when she was 17, and since then, she had worked alongside her mother, learning the business, learning the craft, and learning how to survive in a world that was becoming increasingly militarized. When the war came to Saipan, when American forces began their approach to the island, Tomo and her mother had debated what to do: stay and hope for the best, or flee to the countryside. They had chosen to flee. They had hidden in a cave that her mother's cousin had shown them, a cave carved into the volcanic rock in the hills behind the town. She had survived the battle by hiding in that cave with her mother for 17 days. 17 days without sunlight. 17 days without proper food. 17 days of rationing water from a small underground spring. 17 days of listening to the sounds of artillery bombardment echoing through the stone above them. She had rationed water so carefully that her lips had become cracked and bleeding. They had eaten nothing, or almost nothing, surviving on leaves they had brought with them and insects they had found in the darkness. She had listened to her mother's prayers, whispered again and again in the darkness, begging ancestors for protection, for survival, for mercy. She had held her mother's hand in the dark and tried not to cry, tried not to scream, tried not to give in to the terror that threatened to overwhelm her every moment of every day. When the cave entrance finally collapsed from artillery fire, a massive explosion that filled the cave with dust, stones, and the smell of explosives, they had thought they would die together. Tomo had believed in that moment that this was the end, that they would be buried alive in the darkness, that their bodies would never be found, and that her mother's prayers would go unanswered. But American soldiers had heard them calling out from beneath the rubble. They had heard the muffled sounds of women crying. They had heard the desperation in those voices, and they had begun to dig. They had dug through the rubble, stone by stone, with their bare hands and with tools they had fashioned from debris. They had worked for hours, and finally, they had pulled Tomo and her mother from the darkness. And now, after 17 days of hiding, being pulled from a cave and walking in the daylight for the first time in more than 2 weeks, Tomo was standing in the light. Her eyes could not adjust to the brightness. She squinted against the sun. She felt dizzy. She felt weak. She could barely stand. American soldiers were around her. They were speaking to her in English, a language she did not understand. They were gesturing. They were pointing. They were separating her from her mother, and she was terrified. Her clothing was filthy. Her skin was covered in welts and bites from the lice that had infested every inch of her body. Her hair was matted with dirt and sweat, and she was itching, constantly itching. The lice were eating her alive, literally. She could feel them crawling on her skin. She could feel them in her hair. She could feel them everywhere, but she did not know what they were. She did not know that they were the carriers of a disease that would kill her within weeks if they were not removed. She did not understand what was happening. She did not understand English. She did not understand why the American soldiers were separating her from her mother. She did not understand why they were pointing, shouting, and gesturing at her to remove her clothes. All she knew was fear. All she could feel was the certainty that the stories she had been told were coming true. The stories about what American soldiers did to Japanese women. The stories her mother had whispered to her as they hid in the cave. The stories that had made her promise that she would never allow herself to be captured alive. The stories that had made her mother press a small vial of poison into her hand, just in case, with tears streaming down her face. All she knew was that this was the moment she had been dreading since the battle began. Sergeant Edward Mitchell had been a medic for 3 years. He was 26 years old. He had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, driven by anger, patriotism, and a genuine desire to help. He had served in Europe, in North Africa, and in Sicily. He had seen disease, trauma, and desperation on a scale that had fundamentally changed how he understood the world. He had seen soldiers die from infections that could have been prevented with better sanitation. He had seen soldiers go mad from shell shock. He had seen soldiers kill themselves rather than face capture. And he had learned that war was not about heroism or glory. War was about survival. War was about doing what needed to be done regardless of how it made you feel. When he was reassigned to the Pacific, to Saipan specifically, to help process the refugee population and implement the new DDT delosing protocols, he had thought he was ready. He had thought he understood what disease looked like. He had thought he was prepared for the sight of suffering. He was not. Nothing could have prepared him for this. The refugees were arriving in waves, hundreds of them, thousands. Some were sick, some were dying, some were walking skeletons, their bodies consumed by starvation and disease, and all of them were infested. All of them carried lice in their clothing, in their hair, and on their skin. All of them were potential vectors for typhus. Edward had been trained in the new DDT protocol. He had been trained by military doctors who explained to him in clinical terms what typhus did to the human body. He had been shown photographs of typhus victims. He understood the science. He understood the urgency. What he was not prepared for was the human element. What he was not prepared for was the depth of trauma he would see in the eyes of people who had just survived a battle. People who had been hiding in caves for weeks. People who had been told their entire lives that American soldiers were monsters. He was not prepared for a young woman to look at him with terror in her eyes as he ordered her to remove her clothes. He was not prepared to be the instrument of her trauma, even if that trauma was a misunderstanding, even if his intentions were to save her life, and even if every medical officer on the island knew that delousing had to happen immediately. It had to happen to everyone. It had to happen whether they understood it or agreed to it. But there was no time for explanation. There was no time for gentleness. Dr. Cohen had been clear in his briefings. The delousing had to happen immediately. The disease was spreading. Lives were at stake. Thousands of lives. And so, when Tomo was brought to the delousing station, when she was told in harsh, commanding tones to remove her garments, she began to cry. Her whole body began to shake. She began to pray in Japanese, whispering prayers to Amaterasu, the sun goddess, to the ancestors, to anyone who might hear her and help her. Her mother, who had been separated from her moments before to undergo her own delousing, began to scream. She screamed her daughter's name. She screamed prayers. She screamed warnings. She screamed accusations at the American soldiers. Tomo clung to her clothing with every ounce of strength she possessed. She looked at her mother and she saw her mother's face filled with a mother's terror for her child. And she felt something break inside her. Edward felt his heart breaking. He could see the terror in Tomo's eyes. He could see the way her hands were shaking. He could hear her mother screaming in the distance. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But he also understood something that Tomo could not. He understood that her lice were death. Not metaphorically, but literally. He understood that in 3 weeks she would begin to develop symptoms of typhus if they were not removed. He understood that in 6 weeks, if she did not get medical care, she would likely be dead. He understood that the fever would consume her, that her organs would shut down, and that she would spend her final days screaming in agony as the disease ravaged her body from the inside out. And he was the only thing standing between her and that fate. So, he took a breath. He kept his voice firm. He gestured again, more emphatically this time. Remove the clothing. Now. It was not cruel. It was medical necessity. It was the difference between life and death. But Tomo did not know that. All she knew was that an American soldier was ordering her to remove her clothing. Tomo's hands shook as she reached for her kimono. Tears streamed down her face. She was whispering prayers in Japanese. She was saying goodbye to her dignity, or so she thought. She was saying goodbye to her life as she had known it. She was saying goodbye to the belief that the world made sense, that there was justice, that good things happened to good people. Her mother's screams echoed in the distance, growing more frantic, more desperate. Everything in her was screaming to run, to resist, to fight, but she was exhausted. She was traumatized. She had survived 17 days in a cave by obeying orders, by staying quiet, by doing what she was told. And so she obeyed. The kimono fell to the ground. Edward Mitchell picked up the DDT dispenser. It looked like a weapon. It was shaped like a gun, but instead of bullets, it sprayed powder, white powder. The powder covered his hands as he adjusted it, getting a feel for the trigger mechanism, making sure it was working properly. He had done this 43 times in the past 6 hours. This would be the 44th. But this time was different. This time he looked into the eyes of the woman in front of him, and he saw something that broke through the protocol, the urgency, and the mathematics of disease prevention. He saw a human being. He saw a person who had survived a battle, survived 17 days in a cave, and survived bombardment, starvation, and terror. He saw someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who had done nothing wrong except be born in the wrong place at the wrong time. He saw a young woman standing in front of him, naked and terrified, and he was about to further violate her autonomy in the name of saving her life. He was about to do something that would haunt her for years, something that would shape her understanding of the world, of men, of power, and of violation. The unfairness of it struck him like a physical blow. He wanted to explain. He wanted to tell her that this was medicine. He wanted to tell her that the powder would save her life. He wanted to tell her that he was not going to harm her. He wanted to tell her that in a few months the war would be over and she would be able to rebuild her life, and none of this would matter. He wanted to tell her that he understood her fear, that he respected her, and that he hated being the instrument of her trauma. But there was no time to process it. There was no time to apologize. There was no time to explain because the clock was ticking. The disease was spreading. And Edward had learned long ago that in war, you do not have the luxury of perfect solutions. You have the luxury of surviving. And sometimes survival looks ugly. Sometimes survival requires you to do things that feel wrong, even when you know they are necessary. Sometimes survival requires you to violate someone's dignity in order to save their life. He raised the DDT dispenser. Tomo closed her eyes. What happened next would stay with her for the rest of her life, but not in the way she expected. Edward began to spray. The white powder fell like snow across her shoulders. It covered her hair. It fell down her back, her arms, her legs. It coated every inch of her exposed skin. The powder was cool. It smelled chemical and strange. It was not painful, but it was humiliating. She kept her eyes closed. She kept praying. She imagined that this was the moment the stories had warned her about. This was the violation. This was the reason her mother had told her to run into the cave and never come out. This was the moment that she had feared since the day the war came to Saipan. But nothing happened. No hands reached for her. No advances were made. No further trauma followed. Just the sound of the spray. Just the sensation of powder covering her skin. Just the chemical smell and the cool sensation and the overwhelming sense of humiliation and violation. And as her eyes slowly opened, she saw something that made her confusion deepen. The soldier's face was serious, determined, professional. He was looking past her. He was not looking at her body. He was looking through her, at an enemy that was invisible to her but crystal clear to him. He was looking at the lice that were crawling on her skin. He was looking at the disease that was infecting her. He was looking at death itself, and he was fighting it with the only weapon he had available. The delousing lasted 3 minutes. 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours. 3 minutes in which she stood naked and covered in white powder, feeling humiliated and terrified and confused. 3 minutes in which she wondered if this was really happening, if this was really the future she had feared, if the world had truly become as cruel and as senseless as it now appeared to be. 3 minutes in which her mother's screams slowly began to fade, suggesting that her mother was undergoing the same process, or perhaps had already finished, or perhaps had given up screaming because she too had realized that screaming would not change what was happening. When it was finished, Edward gestured to a table where fresh clothing had been laid out. American military issue. Clean, unused khaki pants, a shirt, undergarments, socks, and shoes. Items that had never been worn before, that had been brought to Saipan specifically for the refugees. He said something in English that Tomo could not understand. But his tone was different now. It was not harsh. It was almost gentle. He helped her into the clothing. His hands never touched her skin. He was professional. He was kind. He was, she began to realize, trying to help her. Or was he? She still did not understand. She still did not know what had just happened or why it had happened. All she knew was that she was no longer naked. All she knew was that someone cared enough to dress her in clean clothing. All she knew was that the soldier had not hurt her, had not violated her in any of the ways she had feared. As the fresh clothing settled on her body, something shifted in Tomo's understanding. The powder was still on her skin. It was still making her itch slightly, but the itch was different now. It felt like relief. It felt like something had changed fundamentally in her body. It felt like the parasites that had been eating her alive were dying. She could feel it, as if her skin was waking up from a nightmare, as if something that had been wrong was being made right. Edward walked her to the next station where her mother was waiting. Her mother took one look at her daughter, clean, clothed, covered in white powder, alive, and began to cry.